Hi, I want to make a video on the subject of maybe your perception feeling is not the thing you're perceiving, or it's either another thing maybe want to mention in this video. It's either more or less, and I guess I want to just discuss. Obviously, I want to discuss the more or less thing real quick because it's an easy thing to begin a context with, and more or less it means more or less deprivation. You make weight value judgments based on the deprivation. You're either hungry or you're either in there's a nail in your foot. I've used that example before, or you're in active pain, or you're feeling kind of deprivation. You're feeling the spring slowly being pulled, as opposed to the string being pulled almost entirely. The nail is all the way in your foot, and you can understand it's about pulling the nail out now and releasing that tension. And so it's understanding the value judgments and only doing your best. And obviously, like I've mentioned before, you can only do your best to understand the expectation, a reasonable expectation of knowing what the best outcome can be. You can only say, okay, I can generally understand that it's good not to do this, or it's not good to do this, or it's best to avoid or do this or do that, and make this judgment, choose this over this. And it's only so much we can do about making those value judgments. Um, we can understand to a certain extent how the goods and um, the things to choose over other things, and it is really just all about value judgment and understanding the best choice to make. So it's either more or less pain, more or less suffering, more or less deprivation, more positive feeling, and more negative feeling. There's either more or less. It only works in that way. It's either you're in a relative position of better as opposed to worse where you are before, or you're worse where you are as opposed to where you were before. It's a relative positioning thing. Um, Even though it's all a negative thing, and there's obviously moving up. Since you're moving up towards a zero. You realize what you're doing is frivolous, redundant. It's just a projection of your own values. It doesn't mean much of anything, and it's almost impossible to avoid those things. They can obviously, align with reality, or align with the real values of existence, but generally speaking, our projections and the things we find satisfaction in are generally speaking just projections. And it doesn't matter if they were just not projections or not. All we're doing is, if anything has value outside of our projections, it's because we're trying to save something from a deprivation. We're trying to save someone from a fire, and that's the only thing that has value outside of our deprivations. Other deprivations, the things that we're changing, because the very value and the very need and the want and the thing that we derive our desire from and our satisfaction is from deprivation. So either we're chasing a deprivation that means more, or a deprivation that means less, based on, say, a decision you have to make. Saving from a fire and preventing horrible death for them, or eating an apple and satisfying your hunger a little bit, like I've mentioned before. It's either more or less. You're either experiencing more or making a value judgment between the more and less, and making a decision based on the value and your understanding of implication of a certain circumstance and the value that thing may be producing, depending on the circumstance. And the value can only be producing based on more pain, more suffering. And that's the only thing value exists on, because value only exists on a deprivation. It's either you have more value by having more negative coming out of you, or you have less value based on less negative coming out of you. Value only lists based on the negative, or how much. And since the value exists on the negative, the way the value exists in a positive is by how much you're going to be saving that thing with a positive. So how many points are you going to be pushing that person out of that circumstance? How much are you risking by going over there and saving them? Will you fall into the fire by saving the person in the fire? Will you be saving them from just burning their leg off? Will you be saving them from, how much will you be saving them as opposed to the apple satisfying you? In the end, the apple may have been the better decision to make, but you never know. And understanding, generally speaking, it's better to save a person and all the implications that can come with saving that person, a good relationship, saving a person from a horrible suffering, you feeling good about yourself, feeling like the hero, feeling like the hero. Everyone gives you a plaque and saying you're the greatest person to exist in the town that you're living in, which you saved the person, or whatever it is. You're now deemed a hero, whatever it is. You get fame, and people take what you have to say seriously, or whatever it is. You never know the implications. You can only generally understand to a certain extent the implications a certain set of actions or a certain event can have on you. And like I mentioned before, you get the positive numbers out of it. If you think like you're going to get more positive numbers, you may end up just going from -5 to -3 or whatever, to put some contrived number to it. By eating the apple, all of a sudden you're a little satisfied. You got a lot of satisfaction out of it. But you go over to save the person in the fire, you go through a lot of negative. So you go from -5 to -10. And when you save the person, you go just right back to -5. Okay, I saved the person, I feel good. Or you get back to -3, Or, it may end up being more of a value or less of a value. There was more of a value exchange when you were going to save the person from suffering in the fire, and you ended up just getting right back to where you were if you had the apple. Or you might have gotten less because you got burned and you got horribly scarred. Or, you didn't save the person and you saw a person die horribly and tragically and you end up just being traumatized for the rest of your life. It's about making these value judgments, and you never know how something may turn out because you may end up just going right back to where you were. Or things can go worse in many cases if you save the person from the fire or whatever circumstance of danger and preventing something horrible from happening. You can just, you can just suffer along with the horror. Things can get just much worse, or things can get much better. I guess it's a value judgment of taking the extreme of either end. The more extreme something is, the more likely the extreme will either be extremely positive or extremely negative. While if you just eat an apple, it's either like 1 plus 1 or minus 1. While if you save the person, it's either minus 10 or plus 10. But generally speaking, it's just minus 10 or plus 5 or minus 10 going from negative 15 to negative 5. It's always on the negative scale, and you're always just fighting the uphill battle of the negative. Um, so yeah, and I guess to the other subject I may want to mention, so yeah, actually I think that's a good video in and of itself. So yeah, I think the more or less thing is something that I can actually make a video on its own. Yeah, so the more or less thing, it's either more pain or less pain. It's about making the best value judgments, about understanding the implications. Usually the more extreme something is, the more value that's on the line, the more value you'll be risking or you'll get a reward based on that. But usually you'll go through the negative risk before you get the positive risk. You'll be at -5, you'll go to -10, then you'll go back to like -2 or something. Or you'll get the apple, but you don't make as much of an exchange. But you may get up and end up getting more on the outrun as a whole. Not only you, but for everyone else. You saving the person's life can have far more of an effect on everyone else than just you eating your apple. It saved you, and you didn't have to go through as much of a deprivation. But then again, you could have gotten more out of that. But the apple wasn't as much of a risk. It's about making these evaluations, these risk evaluations. But then again, you can have prevented a family from suffering horribly, a person from suffering horribly. You feel good about yourself now. You were feeling insecure and crappy, and the apple wasn't going to make you feel that good in any way, or whatever it was you're going to eat, to satisfy a simple deprivation. And now you've satisfied saving someone's life, and all of a sudden you've made a value judgment that seemed to have been better off, and the long-term implications of that could have been better off than, say, eating in the apple. Okay, there's an apple over here. I can go to the store and get an apple, or I can see a person over here. No one's saving them, or just saying I'm going to eat the apple myself, or give them the apple, or making those simple judgments, a more simple judgment, as opposed to such an extreme example as going to the store and there's a burning house over here with 3 people and they're suffering, waiting to get out, but they're trapped. There's only, it's about making those value judgments, and it's either more pain or less pain. You're either going through more of a deprivation or less of a deprivation. It's always on the negative scale because you realize you're always fighting the negative. You're always fighting an uphill battle. You're always fighting to just get a little more satisfaction. You're always fighting the negative because you need the negative to feel like at least you have the illusion of a positive going up. It's not really an illusion. The only illusion that it pertains to is the fact that it's still a negative. You're just going from a negative to a lesser negative, or higher negative, depending on how you look at it. You're going from a -5 to a -2, but you're still going up. It's just you're going up because you're just satisfying a deprivation. It needs the negative first, and that's where the negative comes from, to satisfy the positive. And that's where it really comes down to it. That's how life functions. That's how anything functions. That's how evolution functions. That's how you need to go through all the deprivation just to get to one survivor, for him to survive long enough to do something frivolous and pointless to reproduce, so that he can do the same thing, have 100 kids, to have one survive, and it's just, there's nothing accomplished. You survive, you live, you have 100 things die horribly over a short or long period of time. They live and die. The fact that they have to live to die very shortly after existence shows a frivolousness, let alone the fact that they may have suffered. Even if they didn't suffer, that just shows why. Just for him to be just enough to survive in the existence of reality, to have some frivolous function that doesn't serve any function whatsoever, just to live long enough to find and mate and reproduce, to just have the same process happen over and again. to do nothing more than reproduce again and serve the same frivolous function to evolve and serve no function other than some silly, futile, superficial trait that something may have. Just to take that and, give it on to maybe one or two of their kids and let the other 10 die or 100 die horribly to survive, to be just enough to survive in this existence to reproduce again. You survive to reproduce just to live long enough to reproduce and have almost your offspring die for no good reason, just to have another thing do the same redundant process over and over again. So it serves no real function, it serves no real purpose, it's all futile and pointless, it doesn't do anything. But that's besides the point. Maybe I'm just going crazy. No, I'm not. But I think I'm just looking at things a little more realistically. So yeah, more or less, more time than I wanted to spend on this video, but oh well, better more than less, at least in describing the function and getting a point across that means something. So yes, if I have anything else to mention on the subject, I guess I'll mention it next time, or another video or something like that, right? So yeah, thank you, and until next time, bye.